Hey, welcome to the channel. It's Jack, the muscle and mobility maker with Stronghold Strength and Conditioning. And today, we're going to be talking about the mobility of your lumbar spine. But before we get into it, make sure you take a moment and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on future content like this. Every Saturday, I'm putting out videos showing you how to resolve aches and pains, prevent injuries, and overall optimize your performance inside the gym and outside of it in your daily life and routine. And it doesn't get better than that. So take advantage of it. Ready? Let's go ahead and dive into this one. All right, like I said, today we're going to be looking at the mobility of the lumbar spine, and this one was specifically requested in regards to flexibility of the lumbar spine, but today we're going to just talk about it in general mobility overall, because there's a lot of moving parts, as you'll see as we get into it here, that are to be taken into account when you are addressing how those tissues are impacted in the lumbar spine specifically. So looking at, first of all, things that are actually going to occur movement-wise at your lumbar spine, we have flexion of the lumbar spine, extension of the lumbar spine, and then we have that rotational component, and then lateral flexion as well. So those are a few of the movements that we want to be able to really maximize through our lumbar spine. And it's dependent upon positioning of other things though. So we have to be aware of that our low back health, whether it be low back pain that we're experiencing or just even tightness or achiness around there, is often related more so to what's happening above and below that we have to be aware of. So things like the cervical spine, if I have head forward positioning, there's also a good likelihood that I'm also going to have a similar curvature to my lumbar spine, which is going to inhibit some of my mobility at my lumbar spine as well. So there's something called the Lovett brothers relationship of the spine, and this is an inverse relationship as you go from the center of the spine and travel vertebrae to vertebrae, that each vertebrae as you move up from there is invertedly related. So if my cervical spine again is head forward posture, then my lumbar spine is likely going to take a similar posture in that as well. And again, it limits my movement capacity because of the shape that my body is being held in at that point. Certain muscles will hold more tension to keep that shape, and others will be a little bit more lengthened in that. So both could be tight, it just might be one is shortened, one is lengthened based off of the positioning. And oftentimes this posture can also do with our thoracic spinal column as well. So we need to look at what's going on in our thoracic spine and how we're able to actually extend and rotate through the thoracic spine also, because that is connected through something called our lats. So our lats actually come from the shoulder into the lower back through the thoracolumbar fascia. And that thoracolumbar fascia is a highway junction. It is where there's a bunch of overlapping muscles connecting into that aponeurosis, and that is how our body transfers force and connects the movements of our upper body limbs, our arms, to our lower body limbs, our legs. So we have that big junction to really connect those two pieces and parts, which is why it's important to understand that it's not just about what's happening at your lumbar spine. You also have to be aware of what's going on above. So your cervical spine, your thoracic spinal column, those mobilities are going to impact your lumbar spine. Your hips and pelvis are going to impact your lumbar spine. If I'm in anterior pelvic tilt, very similarly, this is going to inhibit my ability to extend any further. It's going to inhibit my ability to laterally bend each to the side. It's going to inhibit my rotation because my joints are not aligned where there's a lot of space for them to actually move, and they have to be jamming up on each other when I try to move in those ways if I'm in anterior pelvic tilt. So we have to be aware of what's happening at our hips and how that's impacting our pelvis, because our glutes once again connect into that thoracolumbar fascia, as well as our hamstrings are connected in there. And if we go a little bit deeper, you're connecting your psoas in there, your multifidi, and a lot of those spinal erectors in the lower back as well. So there's a lot of different moving pieces and parts that are coming into that junction there. Okay, the obliques are right around there. We have to be aware of how they're functioning. And this is all related to, first of all, we want to address the structure and make sure that those tissues are in good length and position as they should be. If our structures are balanced well, then the soft tissues around that are going to be balanced well also, and that's going to allow for more movement capacity because things aren't out of alignment or not imbalanced with tension and tightness that they shouldn't have. So we look at the structures first in all of those areas that I just mentioned, cervical, thoracic, and then around the hips and pelvis, to really make sure things are all in good positioning there. From there, if we still have tension and tightness, then we can look at different mobilities to actually address some of the tension and tightness around in the lumbar spine specifically, maybe the obliques again. We want to look at those abdominal tissues, the psoas specifically. We want to look at the lats again, making sure that those tissues are good to go, the QL muscle. These are all things that we can address afterwards if we make sure that we first of all have good spinal positioning and stability through our body that is balanced so that it's not putting pressure into that lumbar spine or that thoracolumbar fascia. And then lastly, from there, we do want to make sure that we strengthen our body through that range of motion that we're talking about here. So I need to be able to flex my lumbar spine. I need to be able to extend my lumbar spine while maintaining these other positions. I need to be able to just hold neutral and stabilize my spine without having it go into any movement from there. So the anti-mobilities, the anti-rotation, anti-flexion, those types of things to stabilize the spine well. And then I do need to be able to rotate and laterally flex the spine in that way as well. So those are all key pieces to really developing your mobility around your lumbar spine. Now that was a lot to chew there, but what I'm going to do is actually give you some exercises here that you could start with to think about just looking at these exercises as addressing those areas that I talked about and hitting on the major components of cervical, thoracic, looking at those two, and then around the hips and pelvis. Ready? Let's go ahead and get into it there. All right, first we're going to look at the mobility of the cervical spinal column and how it ties to our lumbar spine. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually flattening my lumbar and cervical spine at the same time, and then also extending my cervical spine and lumbar spine at the same time. So I want to be able to tie those two movements together where when my neck is flexing, my abdomen are also flexing with my tailbone tucked. It might take a second to get that patterning down, but that's what we want to work in this simple exercise, is getting both the flexion and extension to pair up with that cervical spine and make sure everybody's on the same page using those fascial lines more effectively. To strengthen this one a little bit further, we can actually add a band at the base of the skull above the ears, and we're pulling ourselves into that position of flexion there. And we can also add a little bit of a head and chin tuck, so lift off and then press the band back to the floor. But again, keeping that flexion tied with the flexion of the lumbar spine, making sure that I am keeping both parts of my spine as lengthened and flattened as possible to the mat. Next, we're looking at overhead mobility here with thoracic extension. So what I want to do is drive my elbows down into the bench. I have my hands gripped a little bit wider than my elbows, so my wrists are actually outside of my elbows here, and I'm driving down into flexion, engaging everything on the front side of my body there, glutes tight, abs tight, 5 to 10 seconds, and then I want to go into that extension. When I go into the extension though, I want to make sure that it's from my thoracic spinal column. So I keep my abs engaged and we let the thoracic spine do the extension here. Remember, improving the things above and below are going to actually improve how your lumbar spine is functioning. This is another setup that we can use for overhead mobility here while getting that thoracic spine into extension. So again, you want to think of the lats actually being impacted here. Oftentimes, if the lats are tight, it's hard to get overhead. Here I'm using the post as an anchor. I'm actually walking my hands down to the floor, and I'm using the foam roller to help pull my thoracic spine into extension in this position. My glutes are tight, my abs are engaged, so I'm keeping a neutral pelvis, and we're making sure that we're impacting the thoracic spine. Yes, we're talking about lumbar mobility here, but again, thoracic spine is the part above that we want to impact at this point. Next, we're going to look at some spinal rotation here. I'm using a dowel to help assist myself into a deeper stretch in these positions. So I have it over the shoulders. What I want to do is place one end of the dowel by the front foot and allow that leverage to just open up my spine as much as possible here. I want good hip positioning as well. You can see my knee opening toward my small toes on that front leg, paying attention to just keeping that alignment there. Now, this is the easier of the two rotations. What we're going to do next is actually take that rotation into the opposite side and rotate away from that front leg. So keeping the same leg forward, I'll put the other end of the band down, the other end of the stick down, and then rotate away, once again using the leverage. Now this time I do want the stick to be as far away from the front foot as possible to really open myself up. That top hand is just hanging on to the end of the dowel, making sure that I'm able to have a good grip there and that it's keeping me true and honest, really keeping the rotation from the spine as much as possible. Still working spinal rotation here. I've got the foam roller below my rib cage and above my pelvis, so I actually like to use this one almost as a spacer because it keeps you honest if your pelvis is neutral or not and how your body rotates around that neutral position. So I'm reaching through, trying to place my forearms both to the floor as I'm in this position. You're going to get some work at the hips here even, and again a big spinal twist, thoracic rotation all the way through the spine. Next, we're going to address what's going on around the hip and pelvis a little bit more. Here I've got a band attached to the post and I'm pulling down at the hip here. This can provide a nice little traction to the hip and the lumbar spine. So we're centrating the hip and then I'm performing an open book rotation here. So I want my hand behind my head, pulling my shoulder blades to the floor as I keep my knee close to the floor, rotating away there. So we want to start with a few rotations in each direction, making sure that we're able to pull with the musculature of the back to open that up as much as possible. And now, straightening the leg, we're going to incorporate the hamstrings a little bit more. So you can see how we're actually addressing the hamstrings, the glutes in this, and we're giving a little bit of an opportunity to strengthen the rotation through that movement. From here, we also want to address the glutes, making sure that we get all tightness out of those glutes by taking the hip in external rotation so that we can pull again at the hip in external rotation, which is attached to that thoracolumbar fascia, making sure that we're giving that as much freedom of movement as possible. So I'm using the band again to help kind of pull me deeper into this stretch here, and I can flex against the band and then sink a little deeper into it. See me flexing and relaxing here. That's going to help actually get the stretch a little deeper. And then from there, we're going to actually take it into more of a hamstring focused posterior chain stretch. And we're going to take the leg that's out front and plant it with our hands planted next to it. Now I want the band to be pulling me back, so I'm going to actually flex into the band and then let the band rock me back here, pushing through the floor with my leg at the same time to help open up those hamstrings. All right, now that we've addressed the joints and structures above and below the lumbar spine, we can actually start to use some self-myofascial release techniques to help improve what's going on in the tissues around. So here I'm going to release my psoas using a softball on the front side. I want to place it right in that crease where the abdomen meet the obliques, just below the ribs, and I'm going to search that line vertically from the rib cage down into the pelvis. You might feel some pretty intense pulls going down in toward your groin. That would be your psoas muscle doing that. And we can add a little bit of a bend and a straighten of the leg to help floss those tissues. When you bend that leg, you want to think of also doing a hip extension. So you're almost using the ball as a lever or point to push off of, fulcrum, I guess I should say, to push off of in that position. Now, we're also going to go into the obliques here as well, so I'm going to turn to the side, keeping the arm overhead. I want to keep that side that's being released. I want to keep it long. So I'm reaching the leg, I'm reaching the arm, and I want to make sure that, again, the space between the ribs and the pelvis is pretty neutral in this position, making sure that there's equal spacing from front to back in my body here. I'm just letting that ball sink in. I'm testing where those tissues are a little bit tender to the pressure. And then I'm also gonna roll toward the back here and get the QL muscles and those that are next to the spinal column at a slight angle. So you'll see I'm kind of off to the side. I'm not fully directly on my back here. And I'm just gonna roll across those tissues from the side inward to give them a little bit of self-myofascial release as well. From there, we'll want to move into the glutes. So we're going to trace a little bit of a C shape around the ball and socket of your hip into the glutes here, just ensuring that we're hitting any tender points there, making sure that if there is tension being held, that we're going ahead and resolving that. So you want to let that ball go deeper into the tissues. If it's tight and intense, you might just have to breathe on it for a few seconds, flex into it a little bit for 5 to 10 seconds, and then relax, allowing the ball to go a little bit deeper. You should be able to impact those tissues with some contract, relax method, making sure that you're able to just flex, release, and get the ball into those tissues further. And lastly, we want to start to strengthen those ranges of motion. So here I'm working on anti-rotation, anti-flexion, anti-extension. So this is just core stability here with this dead bug with alternating reaches. So I want to make sure that I'm keeping a good neutral spine. My movement is from the hip, it's from the shoulder, it's not coming from my spinal column at all. And we're just going to start here building stability to start. I also like to use glute bridges because if we do not have full hip extension or strength to fully extend the hip, then our lumbar spine will compensate for that lack of extension at the hip. So it's important that we have a good solid glute bridge where we're able to max out the hip extension and get full range of motion. If you're missing range of motion in extension in your glute bridge, you can't fully get that to extend, then that's going to cause your lumbar spine to compensate for that. Next, working spinal flexion, a little bit of rotation, a little bit of lateral flexion, a little bit of extension. We're hitting it all with this spinal car. So here we're doing a controlled articular rotation and we're getting pretty much the full length of the spinal column. The key is that I keep my glutes engaged, so you'll see my tailbone stays tucked the whole time here as I'm working. And then from there, I'm trying to draw as big of a circle as possible, taking my spine through all those different movements from one end to the other, back and forth. Take your time, really smooth it out as much as possible. Feel yourself using each piece of that spinal column to help extend, flex, rotate, and put it all together in smooth movement. I also like to isolate out my rotation quite a bit, so you'll see me using kettlebells to go into resisted movements with the rotation. I will use bands like I'm showing here to pull into rotation. So those are options as well to isolate more rotational component through the spinal column and use that to strengthen those ranges. And similarly, you could do the same with your lateral flexion of the spinal column as well. Here I'm using a side plank, but you could also use kind of a side bend if you were loading with a weight on one side and leaning over to the side. The key is making sure you're aligned well as you're doing these movements. All right, and there you have it. How to mobilize the lumbar spine in a way that's going to benefit flexibility, range of motion, and overall strength and stability through it. You want to, again, take into account what's happening above and below, first of all, making sure that we're addressing structures so that they're in good position to work together as a team. Our spine is one unit. And then we need to look at the soft tissues out from there. After we set the joints in good position, the soft tissues usually will respond well, but if there's still some lingering things, you can address that with some self-myofascial release work. And finally, strengthen and stabilize that new range of motion that you're opening up and the new positions that you're finding. So that is all a part of opening up your lumbar mobility, because there's a lot that goes in there again. If you like this video, make sure you let me know by clicking that big thumbs up down below, and take a moment to share this one with a friend. Maybe they struggle with lower back pain, or they have had a weak lower back for some time now. Just pass it their way, send them the love. If you're somebody who struggles with lower back pain or any other issues that are keeping you from training at the level of intensity that you wish to, and you're ready to receive the help that you need to get out of it, what I want you to do right now is drop down below in the description and fill out a coaching application and schedule a time for a mobility blueprint call. This is our opportunity to get on a Zoom call together so that I can take you through a bit of an assessment, first of all, to identify the root cause of your problem. And then once I have all the information I need, tailor a program specifically to your needs and goals. I can lay out right then and there what I would be programming for you, the full details of how I'd be coaching you through it, and any other details to clearly answer all of your questions in that time. If that sounds good, drop down below right now, fill out that coaching application, get that call scheduled. Last but not least, if you have not already, make sure you take a moment and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on future content like this. Every Saturday, I'm putting out videos showing you how to resolve aches and pains, prevent injuries, and overall optimize your performance inside the gym and outside of it in your daily life and routine, and it doesn't get better than that. Welcome to the Stronghold Army. We'll see you next week.